In 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. I'd like to wish you all a Happy New Year. I'm pleased to welcome Patrick Harvey as a returning member to the committee, and before inviting him to declare any relevant interests, I'd like to record our thanks to Ross Greer for all his hard work on the committee over the last 4.5 years. Patrick, would you like to declare any relevant interests?
I don't think I have any interest that I'm required to declare. Convener, my entry in the Register of Interest shows membership of a number of organisations that might wish to submit evidence to the committee on the budget or other issues. I'll draw attention to those as and when. Okay,
thank you very much for that. As part of our budget scrutiny 26-27, we're taking evidence today from the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body on its own budget bid for 2026-27, and therefore welcome to the meeting Jackson Carlott MSP, member of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, and Scottish Parliament officials, David McGill, the Chief Executive and Clerk, Kerry Twyman, Director of Finance and Resilience, and Andrew Munro, Head of Internal Audit. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting and intend to allow up to 90 minutes for this session. So, Mr. Carlow, would you like to entertain us with a brief opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. And here we are all again. It seems like only yesterday. And indeed, I'm not sure I wasn't here when Mr. Harvey was last on this committee presenting the budget. But thanks for the opportunity to set out the context of the Corporate Body's 26-27 budget proposal, which covers the forthcoming Holyrood election and the first year of Session 7. And while seeking to capture and budget for the impact of the election and potential related uncertainties, a key theme throughout the budget process has been a focus on value for money, prioritisation and reform. And as such, this budget proposal recognises the ongoing constrained financial environment and challenges facing public services across Scotland. And it's only right that the corporate body should play its part in tackling these challenges, driving best value and efficiencies while delivering high-quality parliamentary support and enabling effective debate and scrutiny. The transition between sessions provides the perfect opportunity to reflect on the Parliament's development to date as we look forward to future challenges and opportunities. Now, the total proposed expenditure budget for 26-27 of £150.1 million represents a tiny fraction of the wider Scottish Consolidated Fund expected expenditure, which the Scottish Parliament tasked with scrutinising, effectively 0.25% of the budget of over £60 billion. Although I do reflect it's almost twice what it was when I first joined the Parliament in 2007. Alongside continuing to support our key parliamentary outcomes and deliver value for money across all our services, our ambition was to submit a 26-27 budget bid, which was below the 26-27 indicative. And I'm pleased to report that despite a number of pressures and inflation outstripping our forecasts, this has been achieved for the controllable elements of the budget, which are £500,000 lower than the indicative. And we continue to deliver savings across a range of parliamentary services and contracts, which are reflected in the budget bid. The overall increase of £13.9 million, or 10.2% above the 25-26 budget, is primarily driven by the addition of direct one-off election costs of £8.5 million. Stripping direct election costs out of the budget leaves an increase of £5.4 million, or 4%, and roughly two-thirds of this is driven by increases in office holder costs, with the remainder relating to inflationary uplift and increases in contingency to meet a range of additional risks being carried into 26-27. Now, for MSPs and ministerial salaries, the scheme allows the corporate body to use any index it deems appropriate to inform annual uplifts. And I can confirm that for 26-27, we've continued to use the annualised average weekly earnings AWE index, consistent with the treatment for the last 2 years. And the corporate body firmly believes that the retention of a single index offers a more consistent and balanced approach, rather than being seen to jump between different indices in any 2 years. The application of AWE at 4.3% equates to an MSP salary of £77,710 in 26-27. And no doubt you'll be aware that MSP salaries continue to sit below counterparts in Westminster and indeed the Senate. Indeed, over the period 21-22 to 26-27, MSP pay is lagging 8.2 percentage points behind CPI, which equates to around £5,300 over the period. And had members' salaries risen in line with inflation, they would now be £83,000 rather than £77,710. And I don't say this to virtue signal, but to counter the inevitable reporting of any increase that generated by actions of the corporate body, and point out that that still leaves us behind Westminster and the Senate when the initial arrangement between the three parliaments was that the Scottish Parliament MSP pay sat in the middle of the three. Turning to staff cost provisions, since 23-24, the corporate body has also chosen AWE to uplift the staff cost provision and will continue to do so to ensure consistency. Applying the 4.3% uplift provides a total staff cost provision of £169,000 per member. Following a rigorous prioritisation exercise, the total amount incorporated in the 26-27 budget for projects is £6.5 million, of which £2.5 million relates to the election programme. Original bids totalled £8.4 million, and the reduction of nearly £2 million reflects our careful scrutiny of business cases and project bids to ensure best value for the taxpayer, as well as clear links to Parliament's priorities and outcomes. In our submission, we highlight the projects which are underway or due to commence in 26-27 and provide further detail on the prioritisation and scrutiny process. Significant projects commencing in 26-27 include modernising the committee room conference system and a major redevelopment of the chamber desk, along with continued and expansion of the election programme. The office holders' 26-27 budget submissions total £24.7 million, which is £3.4 million or 15% higher than the current year. A significant element of the year-on-year increase relates to one-off election costs for the Electoral Commission, covering the 2026 Scottish Parliament election and the 27 Scottish Council elections, and the inclusion, for the first time, of costs relating to the Patient Safety Commissioner and the Electoral Management Board. As the committee is aware, the corporate body carefully scrutinises the office holder budget bits and provides robust challenge. As you will recall, the corporate body warmly welcomed the publication in June last year of the SPCB-supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee's report, and work is going on at an official level to prepare for how to implement the report's recommendations, most of which will be for the next session of Parliament. And finally, I would note that we've provided our budget submission in a new expanded format which provides a more detailed look at the SPC budget and specifically what it provides for the Scottish Parliament and the link to our key outcomes and priorities. We've sought to take into account the committee's helpful recommendations from previous sessions, especially in areas such as prioritisation of spending decisions and examples of reform and efficiencies. And this, Convener, concludes my remarks on the 26-27 budget, and myself and colleagues are very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a more detailed report than we've had in previous years. That's very much appreciated. And I did see, Jackson, a wee bit of a glint in your eye when you first mentioned office holder costs, and no doubt that will be touched on as we progress. I have to say I'm not convinced that, despite that your extensive labours in that respect, that the true context of the salary increase will be put into the context it perhaps should when it is reported. I want to start on a positive note in terms of the report, because in terms of what's been reported by the Auditor General Scotland, I noticed that the Parliament has achieved a 68% reduction in carbon emissions by 24-25 compared to the 2005-6 baseline, exceeding its interim target. And I think that's something certainly to be welcomed. And the outturn for 24-25 was 2.1 million less than anticipated. Also, I think it's important to point out the high level of member satisfaction of 90% in services and facilities provided to support participation in parliamentary business, and that there have been no complaints under the culture of respect policy, reflecting a positive workforce environment and commitment to staff. So I think it's important that those are also put on the record. And so I commend everyone at the SPCB and staff for these magnificent achievements. Well, one thing that the Auditor General reported was that the Parliament welcomed 175,686 visitors in 24-25. How does this compare to previous pre-pandemic years, for example?
Well, firstly, can I thank you for your comments on net zero, and the facilities management are continuing to actively develop a strategic investment plan to ensure that a preferred route for making the building net zero ready. So there's continuing work on that at all times, and that has been a valuable part of the work that we've done. Indeed, I recall at a previous committee meeting inviting members to go into the bowels of the building to see all the plant and equipment that was due to be replaced as part of that exercise. I gather it has all now been duly replaced. And although I'm told it looks much the same, but nonetheless, it has all been an extraordinary investment and quite something to see. And I'm sure were the committee so minded to ever wish to have that opportunity to see the outcome of all of that, they would be most welcome to do so. In terms of building visitors, yes, we have obviously seen an increase during the post-pandemic period. I don't know if we have the detail on actual visitor numbers.
I don't have the actual numbers for the previous years with me today, but I can say that we haven't quite got back to pre-pandemic levels yet. There's been an upwards trajectory over the last 4 years, but it hasn't quite reached the pre-pandemic levels again.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be the same urgency in terms of securing tickets for FMQs. I've noticed in recent months, perhaps the performance of those who participate in that, including all of us around this table, is one of the reasons why that is the case.
Viewing figures on SPTV have declined.
Yes, indeed. Okay, let's move on more into the report. One of the things you highlight is continuing to apply a 5% vacancy rate, which you say, it actually improves efficiency. But how does it improve efficiency? I mean, I'd like you to explain how that works. Is it 5% across the board? Is it just, the first 5% of vacancies that occur? And surely there must be certain circumstances in which a vacancy must be filled. It seems to me odd that if you can work with a 5% vacancy rate, then you're actually, you get 5% more staff than you really need, surely. I'm just wondering if you can talk us through how this vacancy rate works and how it makes the Parliament more efficient.
A question we've explored ourselves as members of the corporate body, and Kerry, I know, will be happy to answer.
Yeah, so the rate is set largely blanket 5% across all areas, and that was set some years ago at the beginning of Session 6 as part of the medium-term financial plan. But what happens year on year is we flex. So as you say, if somebody does leave and the post is absolutely integral, they will prepare a business case and that will be considered and agreed, and that post will be filled. And we will look, as I say, on a case-by-case basis. We also have a pattern of using contingency to fill temporary posts where additional flex is needed. So, for example, in the run-up to election, we've looked at filling temporary posts in areas such as the allowances team to allow them to flex to cover that, and then that team will get smaller once that work has been completed. So it's very much it starts with a kind of an across-the-board, but then is looked and scrutinised carefully over the year within directorates to make sure that the posts that are needed to be filled are filled, and then other areas of flexing and adapting where possible. And what we should probably say is the hitting the 5% does vary year on year and between different business areas, depending on, as I say, who is leaving and the nature of the business that's being undertaken.
I mean, you've got a 7.1% turnover. So if there's a 5% vacancy rate, then just a wee sum in my head about, that means the average vacancy is about 8 months long. Is that right? That means you get, that's how it reads to me.
Yeah, we'd have to probably come back to you on the length of the recruiting process. I mean, I think it is some months between a post being left empty, and recruiting does take some time. And we are facing a position at the moment where actually the labour market is quite sticky, so it is taking quite a long time to fill posts. But we can come back to you on what the exact length of time is between somebody going and filling the post.
I mean, I'm just wondering how the SPCB, because it didn't really touch on in its report, how it works together with the Scottish Government in terms of what it has described as, and I quote, a management downward trajectory for the devolved public sector workforce in Scotland, a 0.5% reduction on average per annum over the next 5 years. I mean, it seems to me that they are incredibly modest compared to what you're delivering in terms of this vacancy rate, which is effectively meaning you're operating at 95% capacity on a permanent basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an argument that we would make, is that effectively the Parliament has gone early on this. So as I say, through session 6, we have effectively had the 5% vacancy gap. We've held numbers incredibly level. I think we're looking at a 1% increase over the last 5 years, and that's mainly actually additional security staff for very important safety reasons. And hence, I think why going forward, and David may want to come in on this, you know, we are not looking to cut numbers further. We are effectively going to maintain what we have and try to do more with the current figures that we have.
But the point I'm trying to make is, rather than a 5% vacancy rate, would you not just be better saying we'll have 5% fewer staff? You know what I mean? Is it, you know, and
yeah.
You will basically base it on what is required by each department.
Yeah.
You know, and then when a vacancy comes up, you fill it as soon as you can, as is the normal case, one would have thought, in most organisations.
Yeah, I mean, I guess how the vacancy work is what we're saying is we're not looking to make an additional 5% cuts. What we've done is effectively embedded that 5% within the current staff numbers.
All right, okay, I'll move on. There's a lot of other things I want to touch on, so others may wish to pick that up, of course. Now, one of the things you talk about is reducing electricity bills and usage through introducing LED lighting and other efficiencies as part of the building energy management system. But what other efficiencies have been introduced?
I think in relation to the building energy management system, it allows us a much more sophisticated control of the parliamentary estate. In short, the previous system would allow us to heat the whole building or not heat the building, whereas the new sophisticated system allows us to target areas much more. So, for example, we've just come out of the recess period when we know that occupancy rates in the building were very, very low for the last fortnight. So we asked people that were in the building to go to one particular part of the building which would be heated, whereas the rest of the building wouldn't be. So we have that ability to be much more efficient in terms of where we target the heating and resources from the energy management system.
It's interesting because a few weeks ago I remember members of the committee who usually complain about how hot it is were concerned that it was actually too cold, I think, and perhaps it was you took a decision to drop the temperature just a wee bit too much at one point, but it seems to be just, from my perspective, seems to be just right at the moment. Now, in terms of productivity, you've said that absorbing the impact of shorter working week from March 26 will work through enhanced productivity. So I just wonder if you can tell us how that's going to work in practice.
Yeah, we've spent about the last year or so, because this was a commitment that the corporate body signed up to during the last pay negotiations to reduce the working week in line with societal changes. We've spent the last year encouraging teams to talk about how they might deliver that saving within existing resources. So we're on target to implement that from the 1st of March this year. But the efficiencies that have been generated have been driven by automation, by use of AI, by reductions in numbers of meetings, that kind of thing. We've asked people to look at how they work and what the benefits of that have been. It's a very small reduction in the working week. It's 5%. So we're basically tasking people with delivering their current services within 95% of their current capacity. And we're getting good feedback from business areas across the Parliament that they've been able to identify ways that they can do that. So I'm very optimistic that we'll deliver that on target on the 1st of March.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the issues that concerned this committee at the start of the session was the £3 million plus. It was, in my view, squandered on a not particularly brilliant website, and we obviously took a lot of evidence at that time. But what's been, you've said in your report, is that the efficiency savings have been used through the use of Scottish Government procurement frameworks to drive value for money in contracts. And I noticed that in terms of the consoles which have been touched on, the committee room conferencing system, I should say, that's going to cost £1.783 million. Now, what has been the difficulty in terms of the consoles that we've used at the moment? It says here it's obsolete, but they still seem to be working. So why do we need to spend nearly £2 million replacing them?
Again, I'm sure one of my colleagues can answer this in detail, but again, this is an issue that the corporate body itself explored, members of the corporate body. The obsolescence is in the delivery of replacement parts. As I understand it, we are now having to rob a reduced availability of older units to ensure that the current units continue to function. I am of a generation that find the built-in obsolescence in everything that we now buy extraordinary, on the basis that my great-grandmother probably would still have the same light bulb in her kitchen that she'd had since 1947. But that's not how the world now works. And unfortunately, the obsolescence is such that we can't take the risk of suddenly committee rooms being unable to function because there now is no availability to replace the existing console units. So there has to be a programme of replacement. I think that is the essence of it. Kerry?
No, that's absolutely spot on. So the equipment's no longer supported by the manufacturer. So maintenance and repairs are increasingly challenging. And exactly as Jackson has just said, spare stock is critically low. So my understanding is, when something goes wrong, they're almost taking it from different committee rooms, moving it around, which obviously is very, very risky. And if we have a bigger failure, there's nowhere to go. So I think the idea is it is obsolescent. It's got to a point where putting it off any longer puts the whole thing in doubt. And the decision has been made to actually, in the new system that's going in, to make sure actually that it effectively delivers more. So there's the link up to hybrid. There's better electronic voting, which actually has a knock-on impact on productivity in the clerking teams. And this again then links in with how we're delivering the shorter working weeks and how we're delivering a more flexible workforce. So in all of these sorts of projects, when we're considering them, we're thinking about what's best from a technological perspective, but also what actually frees up critical people resources to enable us to stretch those further. So that's why the decision was made on this one. Could we have limped on another year or two? Possibly. But as I said, if something would have gone seriously wrong, then it would have had a real risk that we would have had to shut down some of the committee rooms.
And I understand that our counterparts in other parliaments now have got the ability to do some of the working functionality that the new console system will provide, and which we do not.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And are you happy about the cost, though? Because it does seem an awful lot of money for these £300,000 per committee room.
I think the word happy is pejorative, if I could put it that way. Are we content that there has been a suitable exercise in ensuring that we are procuring this on best value terms? Then yes.
Right, okay. Now let's go on to office bearers. I know that's always the most exciting part of the session in some ways. Thank you for providing us with some detail on that, albeit I think 4-point, which must be the smallest typeface I've ever seen in the Parliament, but nevertheless I got my magnifying glass out and was able to read some of the detail on that. So if we look at the reports, I take on board a lot of what you've said in terms of the Electoral Commission for next year. But if we look at other office bearers, the Standards Commissioner for Scotland, 9.4% increase. Biometrics Commissioner, 6.2% increase. Scottish Commission for Human Rights, 8.9% increase. And the Ombudsman, 7.1%. Now, we know fine well that when the draft budget comes out next week, it's unlikely that any areas of frontline service will get anywhere near that kind of increase. One or two might, one never knows. But it does seem to me that yet again we've got increases well above inflation for these office holders.
As you know, Convener, since in the years I've been presenting the budget to you, this has been a concern of the corporate body, of me personally, and that's why I was so delighted that the committee initiated the work that it did. And it is the case that if you look at the overall percentage of the budget that we are presenting to you today, that is directed towards the office holders, it is an ongoing increasing percentage of our overall budget and will continue to be an ongoing overall increase in our budget, given the commitments that Parliament has already entered into in relation to the additional Commissioner and the commitments that have been placed upon us. I can only say that And I assure you that these are sentiments that are very much felt by the corporate body, and that we do interrogate the office holders directly and challenge. And there could well be a schedule of areas in which we have declined requests that have been made to us. And I think the way in which we've started to look at these budget bids has been very much on the basis of what is the actual statutory obligation that the corporate body has in relation to the office holder budget or bid, and what within the bid might be in addition to that, and we've become much more critical and less likely to support that. But they too have had additional responsibilities foisted onto them, or maybe that's not quite the right word, but they have acquired additional responsibilities which they too then have to address and meet. And so some of the particular budgets that you were referring to there relate to commissioners who have that additional responsibility and therefore have had to meet it. The vast majority of the cost, though, in all of the office holder budgets relates to people rather than any other area. And as you know, we've previously done everything we can to share services. You'll be aware, or you may not be aware, but many of them, of course, have been located at Bridgeside House. The lease on that ends in 2028, and we are looking over that piece in time to see what opportunity there might be for the further incorporation of office holders onto the landscape here at Holyrood.
Yeah, I mean, for some of these organisations, salaries about 80%. I mean, it would be interesting. It would be interesting in future years to get detail on what has been rejected and why they need additional funding, because we're seeing just the bare figures here now. If you look at the Ombudsman for Scotland, salaries going up from 6.437 million to 6.77 million. Now, I looked at how many staff they've got, and a whole-time equivalent of 80 staff. So that means, on average, the staff salary is £80,000 per person. Now, I don't know who they've got employed there, but I mean, they'll have, they can't all be, you know, they'll have folk doing fairly mundane jobs as well as people perhaps in senior positions. That seems to me an awfully high salary for an organisation such as that. And so, and they do incidentally about 1,500 cases a year. So if you look at their total budget, you know, it's costing about, 5,000 cases. It's costing about £1,500 a case that they deal with. Some of them obviously might be detailed, but when I think about the myriad cases that our offices deal with, you know, on a day-to-day basis, dozens and dozens of cases every day, never mind every week, never mind in a year, and some of which are very complex indeed. One wonders at the huge staff complement they have to deal with a relatively small number of cases. I would have thought 1.5 per week per person. So I'm just wondering I'm just picking on that one because it just seemed to me that they're an organisation every year has an inflation busting increase in their budget, and most of it seems to be salary. I mean, it's now going to be £8.5 million.
Well, I mean, David, I think will come in on this, but I mean, first of all, to say, of course, the corporate body's responsibility is not to examine or cross-examine any of the office holders on the actual execution of the responsibilities. We are there to fulfil the parliamentary.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, the local government committee, for example, takes evidence from for example, from the Ombudsman. I know that I haven't served on that committee myself, but you know, you are actually providing the cash, and I would have thought that questions need to be asked in terms of what actually is happening in the structure of these organisations that means that they need significant increase. Now, it might be the case. I didn't mention, for example, Information Commissioner, because we know that there's a tidal wave of FOI requests that have been coming in, and one could say, well, that seems reasonable for looking at the figures. But for others, when you look at behind the figures, I'm struggling to see the justification for some of these figures, and they seem to be right across the board, really, with the exception of the ethical standards, which is 2.5%. I mean, but the rest are well above inflation, and it's because every other area of frontline service is likely to face challenge when the draft budget comes out, that it seems to me that office bearers seem almost immune to the same pressures that everyone else in the public sector are facing.
And these are very much the reasons and the issues that have been attached to the office holders for some time. These are the things that the corporate body seeks to interrogate with the office holders. and of course have been behind the issues that we've raised with the committee previously. But I know David will speak to this directly as well.
Yeah, happy to do so. Just to give the committee reassurance that there is that robust challenge, first of all at official level before the budget bids are submitted to the corporate body and then by the corporate body. And part of that process involves the same as we talked about in terms of the Parliament's staff vacancy gap, pushing office holders to increase the vacancy gap, reducing and prioritising projects, that kind of thing. And that took quite a lot out of the budget bids before they were submitted to the corporate body. In relation to some of the issues that you've raised, Convener, the salary at the Ombudsman, I'm pretty sure would be significantly lower than the £80,000 that you've averaged out there, because the salary cost will include employers' contributions as well. So it won't be the salary that the staff earn, it will be the complete employment costs. But we can certainly provide that breakdown for you. In relation to one or two of the others that you picked up there, I would say that once you get into smaller budgets, relatively modest changes are bigger in percentage terms. So, for example, I think you highlighted the Standards Commission, 9.4%. That's £33,000, and that's due to the regrading and increasing the hours of a very junior member of staff in response to the fact that the referrals from the Ethical Standards Commissioner have gone up by 44%. So the corporate body interrogated that, were satisfied that there was a demand that had to be met and agreed to that increase. In relation to the Human Rights Commission, they've had to adopt the incorporation of UNCRC, and that's led to an increase in their powers.
So given the extent of this report that you provide to us, would it not be helpful to have a paragraph explaining that each year to save me having to ask these kind of questions? Because inevitably, if costs are significantly higher than inflation, we're going to be asking these questions anyway. Yeah. So it would make life a lot easier for everyone concerned. And it also makes scrutiny easier if we have that information to hand.
We'll certainly endeavour to do that from now on. Yeah.
And in terms of the numbers of complaints from the Ombudsman, it was 5,021 and 23-24, just to get those figures right. And if there's employer costs and salary costs, they should be broken down rather than just their staff costs, because the implication is obviously salary, because you've got additional line with staff-related general costs, so it's not clear where the breakdown there is. OK, I've been asking questions for long enough. Plenty more, of course, but we've got colleagues around the table who annoyingly also want to ask questions, you know. So, first will be Craig, followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Carlaw. You'll be aware that throughout government now there is real pressure to look at making efficiency savings. In the course of evidence so far, you said that it is possible for a 5% increase in productivity because of the lower working week, and it's also possible to carry a 5% vacancy rate. Does that point to perhaps a situation where we've not in the past been as efficient as we could have been, and how much further and faster can you go in trying to make efficiency savings in future years?
I mean, I'll introduce by saying no. I don't think that I draw the conclusion that you do from that. I think we've always been very mindful of seeking to incorporate efficiencies into our operations, and I wouldn't therefore say that we believe we necessarily have the same capacity simply to follow the government's current projection itself. But who?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in first on that point. And just to go back a step really to the vacancy gap, just to try and explain a bit further that this is more about an uptake really. So I think just reducing the staff by that number, you would still have a vacancy gap, because the reality is that there is always a lag between someone leaving a post to it being filled. We try to manage that by not taking the 100% of that budget line and being responsible in that way and making sure that we're not drawing that down. We then run into difficulties, of course, if there is lower turnover, that there aren't vacancies that we can manage in that way, or if we're much quicker in filling posts. So that's why we manage that, and we try to maintain that commitment to having that gap. So just reducing the staff base by that amount would still mean that we would have gaps that we would have to manage, and I would suggest that we would not seek to take the 100% of that reduced line for similar reasons. In terms of the efficiencies that we've looked at, we're really trying to harness emerging technologies, and this is something that we've seen having benefits in particular areas. So, for example, in the official report, they've been using AI technologies to do a lot more speech-to-text, which has created efficiencies there. Similarly, colleagues in SPICE, when they've been looking at consultation responses, which is very labour-intensive, a lot of that has managed to be automated. So it's emerging things that we're really trying to harness just now, and that's something that the new corporate body in Session 7 will be asked to give their support to pushing that as fast and as far as we can.
Just in relation to SPICE, have you been able to assess how many member referrals for research happen year on year? And if AI is going to assist with that, what would you see in terms of headcount moving forward? Is there increased demand from members that would obviously require to maintain a stable workforce, even though AI can do some of the hard kind of graft in terms of research?
Yeah, in terms of demands from members for SPICE, the figures are, over the course of this session, it's a year-on-year increase, both in terms of the volume and in those inquiries that SPICE class as complex. So the headcount there has been directed to that higher demand on their services. And some of the automation that I've talked about would be to try and take out some of the labour-intensive analysis of the volume rather than help to address the complexity. So I'm not anticipating there would be any reduction in headcount given the nature of the demands on SPICE.
Thank you. And linked to that, in terms of pressures on MSP's offices, on the flip side, in terms of the use of technology, we're all receiving far more automated requests, particularly around emotive issues such as euthanasia, gender issues, animal welfare issues, and so on and so forth. Looking at Westminster staff support budget, that's now somewhere in the region of £280,000 a year for non-London-based MPs. So in the same way that, as Mr Jackson's referred to, MSP salaries seem to have fallen behind. And I'm not advocating necessarily an increase in MSP's office cost allowances, but what benchmarking has been done by the corporate body over time to see whether or not the office, the staff salary provision is keeping up, for example, with the Westminster Parliament?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say, of course, is there was a very significant uprating in the provision to members at the start of this session, which was to increase the allowance by the equivalent of one full-time employee, which led to a very significant increase in the overall costs of the Parliament in year one of this session. And that was based on a fairly rigorous review of exactly the criteria that you've identified. My understanding is we continue to run, though, at an uptake of total staff provision below the actual net provision that's provided. Yeah. So we, as we see it at the present time, believe that the provision that we have applied is appropriate. As to what MSPs subsequently choose to pay their own staff, that's very much a matter from them within the provision that exists and is not something the corporate body involves itself in, as we are not the employer of MSP salary, but your colleagues and I are indeed the employer of those individuals.
Absolutely. Just in terms of looking at some of just the grander areas here, in terms of restaurant services, it appears that that's costing £0.8 million potentially.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, just in terms of restaurant services, Mr. Carroll, I think on page, let me find it, Schedule 3, page 42, you identified that that's a cost of £0.8 million. And it also alludes to potentially that there could be a period of double running of the contract, which is presently up for review and award, and that cost would be £46,000. Is this just a periodic re-tender of the contract, or is there any particular reason as to why that is now coming forward?
Yes, it is a periodic review of the contract, and I think the corporate body felt that it was appropriate that we look again at the contract and also at the provision of the services that we currently have. We did actually consult, I think, members on their views about these matters. I've got my view, which is very much that we in some respects, cater to a different age, and that perhaps something different might be appropriate in the more modern era. But Kerry?
Yeah, so just to confirm, the current contract does conclude in July 2026. So they run for a couple of years. So this is us planning ahead for the new contract, the procurement process. And as we've said, just making sure there is an allowance just in case there is a double running, just to make sure that that's factored into budgets.
Fine. And just turning to the kind of, the elephant in the room in terms of the election, there's a significant projection in there, a large element of which is contingencies. Perhaps just for the record, I don't know if Mr. Carlow and Mr. McGill, you might want to say what those contingencies are. What are the contingent dependencies here? What may or may not happen that could result in that? I think it's £6 million contingency being used.
Well, you might not be returned, Mr. Hoy.
Nor might you, Mr.
All
Carlow.
the consequences of that to deal with. But these are the variables that I think are in play, in that I, personally speaking, can't remember an election which seems to be less certain in terms of the dynamics that might be under play within it. And, of course, the Parliament is already anticipating a record number of colleagues who've decided to stand down. But, of course, we have the electorate to consider as well. But there are all manner, I think, of issues that could arise. And David, do you want to detail further?
Yes, it's exactly that. It's uncertainty of the size of the turnover in membership, and members will all be aware of the polling that suggests it could well be at record level. You may also be aware that we normally seek a contingency of £5 million. This time we've thought, because of the volatility and the potential turnover, that we should raise that to £6 million. That money is used to deal with resettlement grants for MSPs, winding up costs for local offices, MSP offices, redundancy payments for MSP staff. So we simply don't know the numbers of that. But the reassurance to give to the committee is that any of that that's unspent will be returned to the consolidated fund. So it's not money that will squirrel away in any sense and direct to other things. If it's not used for those purposes, it will be returned to the centre.
Thank you. And just finally, in respect of the expenditure in relation to the lobbying register, is it now perhaps time to look at the lobbying register more generally to see whether or not it's fit for purpose? I know you've committed about £400,000 to a new platform upon which the lobbying register will operate. But is it time, perhaps in the next Parliament, to look at the operation of and the efficacy of the lobbying register more generally?
Well, I'm grateful to you for asking that question. The corporate body's responsibility is to exercise the will of Parliament, which was that it embarked upon the adoption of the lobbying register, and to ensure that we have everything in place that will allow it to be be effective. I think possibly the premise of your question is it actually performing a function which justifies the cost that the Parliament is spending on it? And I think that would be something that it would be sensible for Parliament to review through an appropriate committee, but it's not something that the corporate body is able to do. But it is a question the corporate body itself has asked in relation to anticipating the additional costs that we now have to spend to ensure that we are able to comply with the will of Parliament in its operation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. John, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. Well, to follow up on that point, because that was one of my questions, I mean, my opinion is that the lobbying register is a complete waste of money. The information comes out months afterwards and serves, in my opinion, no value whatsoever. So, I mean, I do wonder, I don't know if we could write to the appropriate committee and ask them to look at post-legislative scrutiny on that, because I don't know if they've done that, but are you aware, Mr Carlow, if they have done that?
No, I'm not aware of it, and I do actually feel I could reach for that cliche just now and say you might think this, Mr Mason. I couldn't possibly comment.
Yes, I get that. Yeah.
But it is something the corporate body itself has, in the same way that we looked at office holders and draw these matters to the attention during the budget process. When we saw the requirement that we would now need to invest in the lobbying register, a similar thought occurred to ourselves.
Okay, well, the last one worked out very well, I think, from all perspectives on the commissioners, so hopefully we could maybe do something on this as well.
I'm not going to say yes or no at this point.
No,
so you can stop nudging and winking. We'll discuss it in private session at some point.
To you, out of respect. I understand the pay negotiations for staff are continuing. Can you give us any timescale as to how that is going to be finalised?
Yes, I would expect the unions to submit their pay claim during the course of the next couple of weeks. That will then be considered by the corporate body, who will then be asked to agree a negotiating remit. All being well, I would hope that negotiations can be concluded in time for the annual uplift from the 1st of April. If that's not achievable, as soon as possible thereafter, but backdated to the 1st of April.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. The intention of the government is to reduce staff by about 0.5% across the board amongst civil servants and such like. I wonder if that is also being considered by the corporate body, that should be happening for the Parliament and also for MSP staff.
It's not been considered by this corporate body at this stage, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first point I would make is that the reduction that the Scottish Government has signified comes after many years of growth in the staffing situation at the Government. We haven't had that same growth, so I think it would be unfair and disproportionate for us to match that reduction that the Government has anticipated. The second point I would make is that we're only a few weeks away from the current crop of parliamentary committees publishing legacy reports, and we know from experience that at the beginning of a session this can lead to significant demands for extra services or things to be done differently. So I think it would be prudent for us to consider those with the new corporate body in session 7, who will then be looking at the sessional strategic plan, the medium-term financial plan, and it would be during those considerations that we would be looking at whether our ongoing efficiency programme was sufficient or whether we then had to look at some sort of reduction in the way that the Scottish Government is signified.
Mm-hmm. I mean, speaking to staff, I get the impression that, especially over the summer recess, a number of staff, say, for example, security and cleaning, are hanging around with very little to do. Now, I accept you can't sack all the staff in June and bring them back in September, but how do you manage that factor that there's a lot less happening in the building during recesses, but you've still got quite a lot of staff?
I think over the piece we recognise that the Parliament does have peaks and troughs of business. That in no way relates to all people employed by the Parliament. Some staff have a much more stable work programme over the course of 12 months. But I think for a lot of people who manage who are in sync with the cycles of parliamentary business, they've acquired lots of extra time that they then take during the quieter periods, and they're obviously contractually entitled to do that. So a lot of that is managed that way by using recess periods for people to either take leave that they have accrued or to do a lot of planning and training and development work that they just can't do if they're more tied to the cycles of parliamentary business.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, MSP staff has already been mentioned, and the fact that the take-up is 93% on average. But looking at the figures, some of them seem to vary quite a lot. I looked at members of this committee. 2 of the members in this committee only used 70% of their staff allowance in 23-24, which was like 103,000 out of a limit of 147,000. So it seems clear that some MSPs are able to cope with quite a lot less expenditure on staff than others. And that makes me wonder, I mean, we had the big increase, which Mr Carlaw, you referred to earlier on at the beginning of this session. You know, is anyone measuring our MSPs achieving more with this big increase? You know, how is it that, you know, one MSP has 3 full-time staff and that's absolutely satisfactory, but others need to have more? I mean, are we just comparing with Westminster, as Mr Hoy suggested, or are we comparing with some kind of actual reality?
Well, in my experience, and I suppose that's all I can really draw upon to answer your question, first of all, there can be members who've indicated they're not returning and who therefore don't replace staff who may have chosen to leave in anticipation of the fact that they themselves don't intend to return, and that can lead to a reduction in the overall uptake of the allowance that they currently have. And there can be other colleagues I know who can be embarking upon initiatives which can enormously increase the workload in their office. I mean, I would have thought, for example, a member taking forward a members' bill that has attracted a any members' bill, but particularly a members' bill that's attracted a lot of interest. For example, the bill on assisted dying, or Gillian Mackay's bill, I imagine, previously, will lead to a tremendous additional workload for that member's potential office requirement as well. So I think that it's not unexpected that there are variances in terms of the uptake between different members of the Parliament, and that these vary, and in some years they can be totally utilising the allowance, and in other years they may not. And in some years, I imagine, even the allowance itself must be something that seems to be almost inadequate given the level of response they may have received or be having to process in relation to work that they've initiated, particularly, as I say, on a member's bill.
Yeah, I mean, I do understand all of that, but it seems to me that it's a small number of members who would be bringing forward a bill, and if we're paying all the members enough to have that facility, you know, clearly some members are not kind of exercising self-control to keep the costs down, are they?
Well, I've never regarded my parliamentary colleagues as being incontinent, if that's what you're asking me. I would say, from my own experience, and probably as a member, I don't know from the same, I don't longer or as the same length as you, but having entered in the 2007 session, that the volume of inquiry, particularly in the digital age, significantly increased. And I know that the volume of casework that my own office progresses bears no relation, firstly, to when I was a regional member, or secondly, to when most casework was generated either by a knock on the door or by a ring of the phone. And a lot of that is very detailed and very complicated. So my impression is that colleagues are quite rigorous in ensuring that they have effective staff and that they are being deployed effectively. And I can't think what interest would be served by any colleague in not seeking to do that and to achieve the maximum possible return from the investment they make in the staff that they have.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but I probably shouldn't. I'll upset all my colleagues along the way. So I'll maybe leave it at that just now. On the shop, I mean, we've always struggled to have the costs of the shop cover, or at least the income from the shop covering the costs. And as I understand it, people can either come into the Parliament, which means going through all the security system and getting to the shop, or people can buy online. I mean, has there been any thought of, say, having one of the local shops having a franchise and being able to sell outside in the Royal Mile Scottish Parliament products? Because I think some of the tourists would be up for that kind of thing.
That's not something I personally can recall us having explored. I mean, we've gone through the issues of the shop, as you know, before, and you're absolutely right. In order to enter the shop, you have to enter the Parliament. I suppose you can think romantically of the idea of doors onto the main street and people wandering in and out, but I mean, there would be huge security issues relating to access then from the shop into the Parliament. So we are constrained by that fact. I think members of the public visiting the Parliament expect there to be a shop. I think there has been a very considerable effort made in Scottish Parliament branded merchandise to give a much wider, unique offering to the public who actually do come into the Parliament to encourage people to spend more. I don't think we've looked beyond at whether or not that is something that could be franchised out to other operations. Indeed, that might not assist the shop. It might actually, I mean, I'm not saying that we wouldn't benefit from the income, but I don't know that it would necessarily assist the shop. Kerry?
Yeah, I don't think it's been given any real detailed consideration. It would probably open us up to all sorts of interesting tax considerations and being a trading body and things of that nature. And as Mr. Carlaw has said, my understanding is the shop is effectively loss-making, but it is something that visitors to Parliament have openly said that they enjoy and they like. It's part of the wider experience. And as I said, I think the idea of franchising it out would be quite complicated, would take time that is probably better spent in a world, as we've said, that we want to do more with potentially the same number of people. It would probably not be something that we saw as our core priority at this moment in time.
Yeah, no, it was just an idea, and I mean, I wasn't thinking of it instead of the shop, I was thinking of it in addition, because it seems to me there's quite a lot of tourists probably don't come into Parliament but might be interested. I mean, I think some of the products, I have to say, are excellent. I mean, the scarves, I have bought a number over the years and people really, really like them. But anyway, I shall leave it at that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Liz, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you. Can I just refer in your financial statements to section 5, where under travel, accommodation and other costs, the figure goes up from 2.9 million in 23-24 to 3.1 million in 24-25, which I think is just under 7%. Can I just ask, is that largely that increase due to the increase in hotel accommodation in Edinburgh for those members who don't actually have their own accommodation in Edinburgh? Is that the reason for that increase?
Yeah. Can I just clarify, is that from the annual accounts?
It is, yes.
Yes. So, let me double check.
It's under other administration costs, section 5.
Right. I mean, we can come back to you with a concise answer, but yes, my understanding that will be effectively an inflationary uplift based on the price of accommodation in Edinburgh. But let's come back to you with a detailed.
That would be helpful, because I think this is becoming quite an issue, I think, for several colleagues, because the increase in hotel prices in Edinburgh is well beyond the current rate of inflation. And for those colleagues who don't have their own properties in Edinburgh but have to make use of Edinburgh hotels, particularly given the number of later sittings that are happening in terms of stage 3, we seem to have an awful lot of later sittings. Not that I'm objecting to later sittings, but far more than we used to have, and therefore there are more colleagues who are taking advantage of Edinburgh hotels. And I just wondered if the SPCB has thought about having any discussions with hotels other than the one next door, the McDonald or now the Marriott Hotel, to see if there are possible special deals for members, given that cost seems to be rising quite a bit.
Well, we have actually just, now that you say all that, we have obviously discussed that, because that is a matter that members of the corporate body have had drawn to their attention by colleagues within their own groups, particularly during stage 3 sittings. Obviously, one of the things I've noted in the time I have been an MSP is the success of Edinburgh in terms of a destination that people want to come to. I mean, it's quite remarkable. In the walk from the front door to the station, it used to be that you could expect to see certain types of people, students for one part of the year, visitors for another, and now it's almost permanently the case. It's also transformed itself, I think, as a weekend destination, as a city, and of course it's had some very high-profile musical concerts which have tended to absorb a lot of accommodation. And in fact, I think there was one taking place when there was a stage 3 sitting, and we actually were at a point where there was no accommodation to be had, never mind whether or not it was affordable. So the corporate body has become aware of these. We do make it clear that we will fund accommodation to meet that. And I recognise that could be an ongoing challenge going forward, because it would obviously have to be the case that colleagues should be able to meet that cost, and that Edinburgh, in consequence, is becoming a more expensive city in the way that London is.
No, I think the SPCB is generous in that commitment. It's just that obviously, to my knowledge, and you may be able to correct me, that the special members' deals that are offered by the Marriott Hotel don't exist in other hotels, if I'm not mistaken. And I just wondered if it's worth the SPCB pursuing whether there are other hotels that can do that, because I've certainly heard several colleagues complaining that when they've gone to...
I am pretty sure there are other hotel groups that offer these arrangements as well.
For
and I know that the Allowances Office will be exploring that with those hotels. But of course, these are also discussions that are taking place in a commercial environment where accommodation in a city is getting to be even more in demand than it was, I think, when a lot of these deals were initially arrived at. So I'm sure we will continue to pursue that, but I think we are conscious that it is becoming more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it would be helpful to those members who are returned or new members next year, if that kind of information can be put forward, because it has become, as I understand it from quite a few colleagues, a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
And obviously, as I say, with the increase in the number of stage 3 sittings that we're having, then that is obviously a pressure. So
even in the current session, in fact, given the period between now and dissolution.
Yeah, and I was just interested as to whether that 7% increase in these financial accounts on that specific topic was mainly due to hotel rather than to any other aspect. So if you can provide information, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I don't have the detailed breakdown.
Andy?
If I could just add some more context to that, it might be helpful. We've recently concluded a review of the reimbursement of members' expenses scheme, and we absolutely looked at the Edinburgh accommodation provision, which is where the costs of these are met, Ms Smith. So when looking at that, we came to the view that some further work does need analysis does need to be done in advance of the uplift that the SPCB will make to that provision, and that will happen over the next couple of weeks and months. At the moment, in terms of the budget, we've applied the retail prices index to that, but that's only for budgetary purposes. The SPCB is yet to consider what the most appropriate index will be to apply to each of those provisions. We do know that the uptake on the Edinburgh accommodation provision has been fairly low, circa 60% or thereabouts. But of course, when you look at individual cases, there may be those pressures. So we'll present that to SPCB and ask for ways and means
is
to
that
manage
uptake lower than it was previously?
It's been relatively consistent over the session.
Right.
So the areas where we're seeing most pressures are actually people who have, members who have sought accommodation, because we're actually seeing real challenges in that market as well. So we have committed, as part of that report, one of the recommendations is we need to look again at the market to then come back with an appropriate recommendation for corporate bodies uplift. But at the moment, we've budgeted for RPI, all items at 4.3%.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Craig wants to come in on this.
Thank you. Just a specific question in relation to members' accommodation. For those members that have a flat that they rent, which actually in some respects may be a more efficient approach for those who are staying here but live further afield, councils now have the provision to charge double council tax. In recent legislation, that multiplier has been extended. Is that one of the issues that you will look into? And is that putting pressure on accommodation allowances where potentially £2,000 to £3,000 is being added within that? And just one final point in relation to that. The original legislation in relation to double council tax makes provision for an exemption for those who require two properties for the purposes of employment. That includes a Church of Scotland minister living in a manse, but not an MSP who happens to live in the Highlands but work 3 days a week in Edinburgh. So have you made any representations in respect of that?
Yes, we've absolutely made representations to the City Council without much success, I have to say, Mr Hoy. So those representations have been made. In respect to the double council tax bill, then the decision again was taken by corporate body earlier in the session when this became a thing, and is funded separately. Rather than increase the Edinburgh accommodation provision for all, there's a separate provision provided for those who need it for exactly the reasons you cite.
Okay, thank you for that and for that clarification. Michael, followed by Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Given the work that the committee has undertaken regarding the office holder landscape, you can understand, I think, we were quite disappointed to see these costs continuing to rise quite considerably. I suppose it feels a little bit, perhaps we've kind of pulled up the drawbridge as a parliament slightly, but we've got an existing problem in terms of the way that these costs are continuing to rise. You mentioned that some potential future options on shared facilities. I frequently notice the fact that there are parts of the Parliament building that are quite empty for much of the week, given people, I would assume, working remotely, working from home. Could you say a little bit more, perhaps, about what options are being looked at to try and make better use of the estate to bring some of these the office holders onto the campus?
I think I'm reluctant to go into anything that would represent a formal commitment of outcome, only to say that I think that your analysis of the landscape within the Holyrood estate is something that we accept and acknowledge, and that there is work being done that may facilitate more office holders potentially being incorporated within the landscape of the Holyrood estate. And as I noted earlier, the existing lease on the Bridgeside House facility, in which a number of office holders are located, expires in 2028. So I think that will be something that in a future year that the next corporate body will be able to potentially say more on than the current one can, given that we are in the foothills, I think, of exploring the options that might be potentially available as a result of the analysis that you yourself have identified. David?
Yeah, I would maybe go a bit further to say that it's actively being investigated at the moment. We've talked previously at this committee about the accommodation audit for office holders, and as Jackson has said, that will conclude in the first part of this year. The lease at Bridgeside House, which is up in 2028, that will be a 10-year lease. That's led to savings over that piece to date of £500,000. So it's been very cost effective that way, but given that lease is coming up, I think it's incumbent on us to look for different opportunities. One of the new office holders that have come on stream this year, the Electoral Management Board, we will be accommodating within this building for the reasons that you have given. That's a small body, it's a 3-person outfit, so the savings there are relatively low, but £25,000 a year. So if we can replicate that for some or most of the other office holders, that would certainly be something that we're all very keen to see happen.
Okay. Do you have a desk occupancy rate for the campus?
There was an audit carried out, and maybe Andy will be more able to answer that question, but our facilities management did carry out an audit of the use of this building in the last year or so. Andy?
I don't have to hand for this building, David, but I do know from some of the information that I've got from office holders thus far. So this would be in respect of their use of Bridgeside House and one of the office holders who's in an accommodation called Thistle House. I think it's the Ethical Standards Commissioner who's in Thistle House. And I have to say the occupancy rates are pretty low. Now, it is a snapshot in time, so things vary. So hence the reason that we've extended the audit a bit longer, just to get a fuller picture of what a 6-monthly period, 9-monthly period might look like, because it may vary, but the occupancy levels are circa 10 to 20% over a week. Now, of course, that can vary. On a Tuesday, for example, the place might be absolutely full. Monday, Friday, most people may choose to work remotely. So it's finding that balance about, we can't provide a seat for everyone. So are there ways you can adopt your working patterns across all office holders such that we could accommodate you, plus as well as that, meet some of their very specific needs, because some do have specific needs. The Children's Commissioner being one, inviting children and young persons into Holyrood might not be ideal. Similarly, some of the other office holders who hold MSPs to account, for example, may find they would look for other accommodation requirements. So there's a few moving parts, but we're absolutely taking all of that into account with a view to coming back with some proper recommendations.
Okay, so you've given us some detail there, perhaps, on the occupancy rate within the outside the building, and quite striking figures of 10 to 20%, but not for the campus here. If that's not information you have to hand, it could be provided to us.
We can provide that,
be useful. In the commitment made to the convener about the additional paragraph, just some clarity on what that might contain. I think it would be useful for the additional legislative responsibilities for office holders to be itemised under these areas, just so that Parliament can have an understanding of its own actions and the fact that it's putting pressure, I think, and that was a theme that came through the work of this committee as well. So would that be possible within those paragraphs?
It certainly would. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. As I said, the growing percentage of our overall budget that is absorbed by the office holders means that I think that additional scrutiny of what that cost is for, given that it is inevitably driven by decisions the Parliament itself has made, would be helpful. Particularly, again, because what the committee has initiated and what Parliament has done is take a view about the creation of additional commissioners in the future. I think there's still work to be done, personally, in looking at the overall benefit of all of the commissioners we currently have.
Yeah, and that brings me to my point. I think that I was struck by the evidence of the Biometrics Commissioner when he was sat in front of this committee, sat where you are, Mr Carlaw, and telling us that essentially there could very easily be an end to his work, that actually there were certain pieces of work that had to be completed, and therefore at the conclusion of that work, they could pretty much pull down the doors and say, you know, we're done here. Any indication from any of the office bearers that they feel that their work is done?
Well, I shall be racing to consult that particular entry in the official record, Mr Vara, but it's not something that's been volunteered to us at the corporate body and the engagement that we've so far had with the various commissioners. Indeed, I think we just saw the Biometrics Commissioner at our last meeting before Christmas. In December. Yeah. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and it may be that work profile has changed over since we've had it. And I suppose my last point on this then, this area, I'm a little bit concerned, I suppose, by the process. And I wonder whether there's an issue here about you talking about bids and the fact that the corporate body has rightly borne down on asked some probing questions. And so we would have been seeing much higher figures, an additional 5% perhaps, I think it essentially alluded to, across all of these different areas had the corporate body not done its work. Is there a problem just in the way that this works? Is that the office holders come and make bids rather than being told, here's your budget, this is what you're getting, and actually you've got to be efficient enough to deal with it?
No, I think that there has been quite a transformation during the course of this session in terms of the entire engagement and focus that there has been brought to bear on the office holders. I think the expansion of the number of office holders was initially something that concerned the corporate body, in that that additional responsibility that we have for office holders had to be incorporated into the agenda of work that we had across all other areas. And there have obviously been all sorts of discussions that have taken place and arrangements that have been agreed in Parliament between the various committees that scrutinise the actual performance of the office holders and the way in which we engage. And we've stepped up considerably during the course of, certainly in the second half of this Parliament, stepped up considerably the engagement that we have with the office holders, and they're coming to speak with the corporate body, not just at part of the budget bid process, but during the course of the year as well. So I think that we, obviously, they require to make an annual submission in relation to their budget, but I think that we are not just waiting for that annual engagement to take place, we are scrutinising the actual deployment of any resource that we've agreed, so that we are more familiar with the work that they're doing before any budget bid comes before us, particularly to avoid late contingency requests in particular, which we've been much more circumspect and critical about.
Mr McGill?
Yeah, I think you make a very good point about the decisions of the Parliament leading to additional costs on office holders, and I think I should probably highlight at this stage that there are a few of those that are pending. You may be aware that the committee that was established by the Parliament to scrutinise the landscape suggested, for example, that the Ombudsman be given own initiative powers, and that'll be something that will be cost-bearing. We've got a few members' bills kicking around at the moment, one on FOI that would add a six-figure sum to the work of the Information Commissioner. We've got a Sustainable Development Bill that would create a Future Generations Commissioner at possibly a seven-figure cost. The Biometrics Commissioner is due for a statutory review at the end of this calendar year. That could conclude in his remit being expanded into other bodies. So there's lots of things that are in the pipeline as potential additional costs that we know of at this stage, despite all the work that this committee and the committee that was established by the Parliament to look at this has done.
Okay, thanks for that. On a different matter, the relating to the running of the Parliament and the general budget, there is allocation for enhanced parliamentary business at the end of session 6. I mean, that feels slightly commendatory language rather than pejorative. I have to say enhanced. I mean, frankly, it's chaotic, the running of the legislative programme. As representation has been made to the government that actually the way they're running the legislative programme, the fact that we spent years having debates without motion and pointless discussions, and now we're cramming in an unbelievable amount of bills at this point over multiple days with late sittings. This is a problem of the government's creation. Has the SPCB made the representations that this actually costs the taxpayer money, let alone having bad legislation out the other end of it?
That's a serious question. David?
Well, the answer to that is no, because the corporate body takes the view that its statutory role is to provide the Parliament with the resources required. The issues that you're referring to there would be more a matter for the Parliamentary Bureau, and the Parliamentary Bureau does take seriously the impact towards the end of the session. I think at the moment we're looking at 3 stage 3s this month, 3 next month, and then 6 in the run-up to dissolution. And some of those bills are quite considerable bills that will attract a lot of amendments and will require a lot of time. The corporate body sees its role as to make sure that that happens, and it supports the business areas in allocating additional resources or supporting the movement of resources within budgets to make sure that the Parliament is able to legislate and scrutinise and hold the government to account.
So I come to this as I was elected for the first time at the start of this session, but it feels to me like it's total chaos. And it doesn't feel to me that the Parliament is dealing with it well at all. It's resulting in, as I say, a mess of amendments. It doesn't feel that we're getting good law out the end of it. I understand the restriction, though. I suppose my issue with doing your own report is that word enhanced. It doesn't feel enhanced. Perhaps we could look at that in future.
We'll maybe choose to be less Delphic.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Can I come back to the issue of one-off election costs? I think both Jackson and David have talked about the current circumstances and the expectation of political volatility, meaning that might be a bigger element this time than other times. But one-off election costs, whether that's winding up allowances, setting up new offices, what have you, is always fairly significant. Isn't there a mechanism to spread that cost across the session and budget for it over 5 years? Why does it create so much variation year to year in terms of the budget during an election year?
I think the answer to that is that lots of the costs that are budgeted for within that pot are statutory entitlements that only kick in once the consequences of the election is known, whether that be for members or for the staff that they employ. So I think the ability to spread that over more than 1 year would be extremely limited.
But you know that there's going to be an election at least every 5 years, and you know that there's probably going to be a reasonable minimum expectation about the level of turnover. Would it not be reasonable to have a separate longer-term pot set aside to allow that to be smoothed to the greatest extent possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that would work when people have the entitlements that, as I say, kick in on the loss of office, for example, or they have employment rights to redundancy payments that only kick in at a particular point in the parliamentary cycle. But maybe Kerry can...
those need to be paid for during that year, but can they not be budgeted for over a longer period?
I see the distinction you're drawing, but yeah, I think Kerry can talk about that.
So from an accounting point of view, obviously that they have to be paid in the year in which they incur. I think what you're actually alluding to is kind of forward planning purposes, and that will be something in the medium-term financial plan, for example. We will look forward and look at where we know that there will be specific costs falling in a specific year, and we will flag those. To be honest, there's not really any benefit from a budgeting point of view in us spreading the cost over the next few years, because we draw down from the wider Scottish Consolidated Fund. Without being flippant about it, we are a rounding error on the wider Scottish Government budget. So us spreading it out over 5 years wouldn't really create any additional benefit. But what you're absolutely right about is in our forward planning and what we're doing, making sure that those are considered, and where we can potentially spread it across years, we absolutely should be. So, for example, not the election contingency itself for the resettlement costs, but within projects we have £2.5 million, which is more the new IT and things of that nature. Some of that has fallen indeed in this financial year, and part of what we're looking at the moment, we have a little bit of an underspend developing, and so one of the things we're looking at is, can we bring forward any of that expenditure? So, for example, where we know that we'll need IT equipment, can we buy it at the end of this financial year rather than next year, which is prudent financial management.
Okay, thank you. The issue of late settings has come up from a couple of other members, and I think in relation to Michael Mara's questions, the tail end of a session, I think, is always fairly busy. This one seems to be more significant than most, but it's always fairly busy. Even setting aside the tail end, though, the fact that we've got a lot of legislation at the tail end, late settings have been a bigger factor in this session than I can remember before. I'm assuming that although that will carry some kind of one-off costs when those happen, it hasn't been a very significant figure in terms of the overall budget yet. At what point would that start to cause worries? At what point, in terms of the frequency of late sittings, would the scale of the financial impact start to become a worry?
Well, I think 2 points. Firstly, yes, in the previous session, of course, we were still in the throes of COVID, and I think the end of that session meant that quite a lot of bills just had to be dropped, particularly members' bills, which couldn't progress. And so there were different reasons as to why that was quite an intense period ending. I do think that at the beginning of this session there were 1 or 2 bills which actually tested the operational efficiency of the building in terms of employment contracts and our ability actually to maintain the operational function of the chamber and then to have people available first thing the next day within various working time operations that that we're bound by. I think we've been fairly able to deal with all late-sitting requests that there have been subsequently, and obviously David will confirm from just as he did a moment ago, we are well aware of what's forthcoming and therefore will be planning accordingly.
Yeah, I think this session the corporate body has been a lot more active in discussing these matters with the Parliamentary Bureau, because obviously there are different interests there and different responsibilities. But the corporate body was very concerned at the impact on both staff welfare and costs when we had the 2 very late sittings to do with the GRR bill at the start of this session. And they came to an agreement that a working assumption is that a stage 3 should not go beyond 10 o'clock in any evening. And that allowed people to get home rather than be looking for hotel accommodation. It also allowed for staff who were required to be on duty early the following morning to have a reasonable gap between leaving and coming back into work. And I think you've seen that in recent large stage 3s that have been spread over 2 and even 3 days, which didn't necessarily happen before. And I think that is the Bureau's assumption now, that if the 10 o'clock limit looks as if it might be reached, that they're looking at a second or a third day to spread out the load and allow the corporate body to budget for that being the case, rather than finding extra resource to pay for overnight accommodation and things of that nature.
Yeah, I'm really just thinking about looking forward. If we were to speculate that the trend towards this becoming more frequent, of 10 o'clock sittings, 2 or 3 day stage 3s, which previously just didn't happen at all. If that became more common in the next session, you know, does a limit get reached at which point it creates financial consequences which simply haven't been accounted for, haven't been planned for?
Well, I suppose as a member, I would say, looking at this, that the length of stage 3 proceedings is itself something that Parliament might want to consider.
Yes, I agree.
Because it has seemed to me that we have revisited territory that was fully explored at stage 2, and my historical understanding was that that was the parliamentary process, and that stage 3 was therefore not something that would extend in quite that way. So I would very much hope that Parliament might look to the way in which it proceeds with legislation to try and address some of these issues, rather than accept that stage 3s were going to be typically of the character that you've just described, would be my own personal view.
Okay, thank you. Last point, convener, is on the accommodation issue that came up earlier, and it's more of a suggestion really than asking for a response right now. But if there is going to be further work, as Andrew Munro was talking about, looking at the Edinburgh accommodation provision, would it be reasonable to suggest that it could include a principle that if a member in a Group 2 constituency, a member whose principal home is a Group 2 constituency, can show that renting a room is cheaper than renting hotel rooms, that they should be allowed to do it?
We can take that on board, Mr Harvey, absolutely.
I imagine there would be some members who don't feel that they need to rent an entire property, but would be perfectly happy to have a room of their own rather than hotel rooms from day to day and week to week.
Yeah, we've recently concluded that review of the scheme that the presiding officer wrote to all members just shortly before Christmas with the outcome of that. So that didn't feature as part of that review, but point noted when SPCB considers its uplift later this year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have to say, since we discussed energy efficiencies, the temperature in this room appears to have dropped markedly. I don't know if I'm the only one that's noticed that, apart from Michael. He pointed it out to me a minute ago. It is Baltic in here, actually, so you might want to... Well, again, if it's Baltic and you're following your engagement, what does that say about your engagement? Michelle?
A couple of final questions. Thank you. So, first of all, I just wanted to add my thanks to the detail, the increased detail. I think that's been very helpful, and it'll be good to see that carrying on. Just finishing off on the shop, you mentioned a review. What exactly is contained within that review? And what I'd like to understand is, what are your strategic intentions for the shop going forward? So we recognise it's loss-making. It's arguably a hygiene factor. We've talked about subcontracting services, but I'm just not clear what your intentions are for the shop. And so if you could tell me more about the review and what the strategy is.
Yeah, sorry, to clarify, I think we said we hadn't done a review looking at the idea of having
an... I mean, in your papers you say there's a review of the shop underway. What is being reviewed? Right. What's the terms of reference in effect for that?
Okay, we'll have to come back to you with that detail. I don't have that detail on hand.
I think one of the things we're looking at is whether the current location is the best, not just from a financial point of view, but from an engagement point of view. One of the examples that I would give you is that during the Festival of Politics, we had a pop-up shop in the garden lobby area, which was a great circulation space for people coming in. And that was quite successful over the 2 or 3 days of the festival. So the review will look at whether having pop-up shops elsewhere, maybe in the main hall or in the garden lobby, might be more cost-effective. But all of this is under review all of the time, because we do recognise it's loss-making. It serves other purposes, but in a financial sense, it's not washing its face.
And so from that, can I take that you are looking, if at all possible, to move it from loss-making into at least wiping its face?
That's always the aim. So
Okay.
far, that's eluded us, but that is always the aim. One of the other things that we're looking at, I think it was mentioned earlier in response to John Mason, that some of the most popular items are Parliament branded items, so promoting them more, trying to capitalise on the fact that that seems to be where the demand lies primarily. So the review will encompass those issues as well.
And how about the split with, I mean, in terms of turnover, what's the split between visitor-led and online? I noticed that wasn't in your figures. I don't have a sense of that in income terms. What's the percentage split?
I'm not aware of that split, but we can certainly provide that.
Okay. I did, in preparation for this session, think, oh, I'll have a wee look at the kind of online offerings. Staggered to see there was no January sale. Is it just me? But, I mean, I get a general sense from talking to you and even not able to provide this information, it's still not being looked at as a business, even although I totally appreciate it's not a business and you're working under certain constraints. But that kind of thinking, because I would expect anyone or all of you to be across these numbers at any given time. And this goes back to a comment that Daniel Johnston made a few years ago, if you recall, Jackson, where he said, let me have a look at this from his retail background. But I still get the sense that we're not even at the starting gates here. Am I wrong or unfair?
We've got a big sale coming in May of members, I think, but I'm not sure if that's quite what you were alluding to. Obviously, the shop will, in part, be a function of the number of visitors that there are to the Parliament. And as David said, we've not yet returned visitor numbers to pre-pandemic levels. It's also, I think, arguable that the Parliament is looked at differently now by the public than it was when it was initiated 25 years ago. And I think that, therefore, the demand to watch proceedings on SPTV having declined, and as has been pointed out, and it certainly struck me just as a member in the chamber during the course of this session that the public galleries have been less occupied than at any time previously, that the Parliament itself has to think about its operations, and we need to obviously be a Parliament that since that is what we want to do, that will encourage people to come and visit us and to see us at work. And I think the shop is a function very much of the overall number of people that will choose to do that. And I think that lack of, that non-return of public engagement post-pandemic is something that ought to be of general concern to us all.
I would argue, actually, the reverse could apply. If you were applying a kind of entrepreneurial mindset to the shop and took on some creative ideas, you could actually bring more people into the Parliament as a result of increased brand awareness. But I mean, I don't want to go off on one, but that's sort of what I mean about I have no sense.
Well, I hear what you say. I mean, I suppose if I was on a personal level to be involved in a discussion with you on these matters, I might think that was wishful thinking and that might bring in a few people from the Edinburgh area. But obviously what we're very keen to do is to bring in people from the widest possible area. And I would like to think it was because of the work of Parliament rather than the offering of the parliamentary shop.
I absolutely agree with that last point. No, but the point I'm making about that is not about footfall. If you were focusing on an online proposition and you were directly marketing to our diaspora, for example, in North America, and had a proper marketing position, you could absolutely increase your turnover. Anyway, I digress. Another area was going back to the office holders. I mean, obviously, it's going to get to a point where it's going to be a concern for everybody. But when we looked at our Commissioner's report, one of the things that became apparent was there's almost like an accountability gap between what you're required to do, which is to scrutinise budget propositions, and the overall kind of parliamentary responsibility for increasing costs. So you mentioned in your earlier comments about there's been an increase in responsibilities for some of the office holders. And you then, so that happens over here then you look at what are the implications of that in an increased budget request. Do you agree that there's an accountability gap, and that may well occur in other areas as well? And going forward, as we as a committee will do our kind of legacy report, will the SPCB be highlighting areas where the overall kind of scrutiny and effectiveness of spend, from your perspective, will be revisited?
Well, but I do feel we've explored these issues during the course of this Parliament in terms of the breakdown in the responsibility of the corporate body and the wider Parliament in terms of holding the various commissioners to account. Our function has always very much been to fulfil the direction of Parliament in relation to the fulfilment of the obligations they have made of the commissioners they have created, and that is where our responsibility rests. But I thought there almost was a contract that had been arrived at in terms of the wider scrutiny, which I think ought to be an issue of ongoing concern and consideration.
Yeah, the corporate body did reach a written agreement with the conveners group this session, which detailed more clearly that split between the governance role that the corporate body has and the accountability role that parliamentary committees have. We did identify that that had been a weakness that hadn't really been happening before, so that written agreement was designed to address what we identified as a gap. In terms of the corporate body's role, I would just point out that the ad hoc committee that looked at all of this recently did conclude that the corporate body was best placed to fulfil the role that it has established here. But it did make recommendations for parliamentary committees to have more of an oversight. So that will be a matter for the Session 7 Parliamentary Bureau to address those recommendations.
Okay, that's heartening to hear. And I mean, I won't be here, but it would be interesting to see the agreement with the conveners group, how that ultimately reflects in the cost of office holders. And I'm sure that I hope there'll be people watching that with interest. Anyway, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. That's concluded questions from around the table. I just want to follow up with one or two questions of my own about the shop, which I didn't ask earlier on, and it's been interesting to hear the questions from that. I think, you know, as we get record numbers of people in Edinburgh, one would have thought we'd have more people in the Parliament. I mean, what kind of hours does the shop keep? What are the opening hours?
Well, I'm personally not aware of the answer to that. I suppose we would have to come back to you.
Yeah,
I can't tell you the hours the shop keeps, no.
I mean, because in the terms of the report, it talks about salary of £130,000, which is 1.33 of a G2. A G2 earns between 30 and 32,000 a year. This says direct salaries, incidentally, not employer costs, etc. And a manager, so. But it also includes overtime costs. I'm just wondering when there's overtime work there, because it doesn't seem to be open that much, the shop. You know, it's not open 7 days a week or anything like that, is it?
I imagine the shop is open when Parliament is sitting.
Yeah, so that's only 3 days a week. So just
parliamentary sitting days and on other days too during the week when the creche and the cafe and other parts of the building are open to visitors who wish to see it.
Right, so basically it's only open 3 days a week. So I'm just wondering why the salary costs.
I'm saying it's open. It's open 5
days a week. Sorry,
yeah, it'll be open all the days that members of the public are visiting the campus.
Yeah, 9 till 5 then, really.
I can't answer that. Right. I mean, I don't have the detail of that.
Yeah, so just wondering why there's overtime costs in terms of 10:30 to 5:30. Why there's overtime costs if it's only open normal hours, effectively. Secondly, I mean, you know, a lot of members have made really cogent points. There's the size of the shop's an issue, but there also seems to be no real interest in improving the stock. The stock's the same as it's been for years, let's be honest about it. And I noticed that in 2023-24, it was 222,000 was the sales, and it's anticipated next year, despite inflation, of being only 1% higher at £225,000.
I don't think it's fair to say the stock is the same. There's been actually quite a considerable effort entered into during the course of this session to come up with stock which is more unique to the Parliament itself, and well, I've seen that. I mean,
well, it's no selling then, is it? I mean, and one of the things that Michelle raised was the fact no January sales. I don't think that was a flippant remark. I mean, I went to buy a decade ago 10 Christmas cards and I was told it would cost £6.50 or whatever. And I said, what if I buy 100? Well, that's just 65 quid then, isn't it? There's no like, you get them for, you know, anywhere else you buy things in bulk, you get a discount. So there's absolutely no effort whatsoever made. So I just didn't buy any, obviously, right? So, but you got my own ones made like many other colleagues do. So I just think there needs to be a wee bit more thought put into this shop and what it can achieve in terms of variety of the stock it sells, in terms of the marketing, you know, as been alluded to, discounting, etc. And why not have sales, you know, once or twice a year? That has been tried very, very, you know, in a very tepid way in the past, but there's not really been much effort. And so I just think a wee bit more thought should go into that. That's all. The only
I think there have been
points I was
special
wanting
discount days
to
and days
kind of
in
make.
which we...
Yeah. So a wee bit, but that's really only for members. It doesn't really apply to the public so much. And I think maybe the public, if they were able to know through, because I don't think there's any marketing of the shop at all. But anyway, that's the only thing I was really wanting to kind of mention there. Hot water bottles and thermals, for example, might be a good marketing item at this particular moment in time. Sorry, John.
Yeah, just for the record, I have checked the proper website just to get the times on the record for when the shop is open. So that is Monday, Friday and Saturday 10:30 to 4:30, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday 10:30 to 5:30.
Right, okay, thank you for that. Okay, so we've got that on record. It's interesting that none of us actually knew that, even though some of us have been here for donkey's years, you know. But the location of the shop itself and its size, it's very pokey and not actually something that is a pleasant experience to particularly wander around. You go around and you buy your bottle of whiskey for your annual raffle, which is what I do, or auction, and get it signed by the First Minister, and that's about it, because I don't think there's a lot of incentive to go in there. Okay, any further points you want to make, Jackson, before we wind up this session?
No, I'm reeling it that you are hitherto undisclosed retail expertise on shopping experience, and I undertake that we will give robust consideration, or in our legacy report, certainly to the new corporate body, to give further consideration to how we might improve the offering and turnover of the parliamentary shop.
Excellent, good stuff. Well, thank you very much for your contributions this morning. It's been very much appreciated. I'll now call a 5-minute break before we have the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.
Roll in. The next item on our agenda today is an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance on the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Investment Zones Relief Scotland Order 2026. I intend to allow around 30 minutes for this evidence session, although the SSI is our final item should more time be required. The Minister is joined today by two Scottish Government officials, Laura Parker, LBTT Policy Lead, Directorate for Tax and Revenues, and Liam Farrow, Head of Regional Economic Policy. Good morning, Minister. I'd like to welcome you and your colleagues to our meeting and invite you to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning and Happy New Year to you and to the committee. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss this SSI with you today and look forward to the committee's questions. As you know, there are two investment zones in Scotland, one in the Glasgow City region and one in the North East, and these are designed to leverage research and innovation strengths to boost productivity and increased innovations in our regions. Through the incentives on offer, they can make a major contribution to attracting private investment, promoting growth and creating good jobs in key sectors such as advanced manufacturing and green industries. The investment zones are a collaboration between the Scottish and UK governments and the Glasgow City region and North East Scotland regional partnerships. The regional partnerships are ensuring that regional interests remain at the heart of this work and that the benefits and opportunities of growth are felt by communities throughout investment zone regions. Glasgow City region and the North East have engaged extensively with regional stakeholders, including businesses and research institutions, to develop proposals for their investment zones and secure appropriate buy-in. The Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Investment Zone Relief Scotland Order 2023 provides relief from LBTT in part or in full for qualifying transactions within a designated investment zone tax site. This is part of a package of incentives offered to the investment zone. As part of the partnership working arrangement with UK Government, it was agreed that we would ensure as much as possible that the overall offer in Scotland is equivalent to the offer available to investment zones in England and Wales. And the LBTT relief is designed to be equivalent to the stamp duty land tax relief that is offered to investment zones in England to ensure that this parity is met. The LBTT relief supports the overall programme by encouraging investment in specific tax sites on land that is underdeveloped or undeveloped, and the relief will be available immediately once the tax sites are designated for a period of up to 5 years.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you whether there's any concerns about displacement activity with regard to these investment zones? Because one of the issues, we discussed this with Greenports a couple of years back, is that when a specific investment zone is set up, people remember way back Radio Clyde, moving to Clyde Bank, for example, when it became an enterprise zone. It didn't really create any jobs or anything like that specifically. It just actually moved from one part of the city to just outside. So is there any concerns about displacement in terms of this, which would just mean, reshuffling the deck, so to speak, but not actually creating any additional wealth?
Yeah, it's a fair comment. And I think that it's important to look at this, and indeed the Greenports work, through the lens of what it is we're trying to achieve, which is to create those clusters of businesses in those high-tech, forward-looking technology areas, and to create that coalescence around a geographical space that allows those cluster effects to take effect and help to deliver a multiplying effect across those areas. Now, if you look at the reliefs on offer, LBTT is something that you benefit from when you move. So somebody, by definition, would have to move to get that, but they only get it by virtue of the fact that they're moving, so it's not an incentive per se to move into the area. People that are looking to move into create something, typically those businesses are looking on the international context. So they're looking for what Scotland got to offer to come here rather than go elsewhere. And they're looking at the cluster and around the package of incentives as part of that. But I think it's fair to say that the bigger part of it is round about what other businesses are there, what the supply chain looks like there, what the skills pipeline looks like there, what the opportunities for them finding customers are there. Is probably much more of an attraction than anything that we're doing round about these particular reliefs.
So will these zones be in competition with green ports, for example? Well, I know they've got green ports are obviously ports, but I mean, in terms of attracting investment, is there going to be?
Well, they're focused on specific areas or specific technologies. In the one in Glasgow, obviously centred around advanced manufacturing and AI, so it's quite a specific focus. The green ports obviously are very much focused on supporting the offshore sector and the rollout of offshore wind, floating in particular. So they've got different specific areas of focus with regard to the type of technologies and industries they're trying to attract.
And why were these two areas picked, for example? So, for example, my area in North Ayrshire has got the highest level of vacant and derelict land proportionately in Scotland, so it would be deemed to be underdeveloped. So why, for example, would Glasgow be picked as opposed to, for example, an area in North Ayrshire which also has second highest level of unemployment in Scotland? Michael Marra could no doubt make a similar claim for Dundee.
Yeah. Well, the process was going through as a joint process with UK and Scottish Government, looked at a number of factors. I mean, I wasn't involved in that process at the time, but as I say, it was a rigorous process looking at a number of factors, of which the opportunity or the availability of underdeveloped or undeveloped land is part of that, but clearly there are other factors there in terms of the existing business activity, its location, with regards to access to technology, the role of universities in this obviously is key as well. So a number of factors were chosen. Of course, in a perfect world, we'd want to be perhaps creating more investment zones, but the offer from the UK Government that we took up was limited to two, and that is the two that were chosen.
Okay, and a kind of final question from me. What additional wealth are you hoping these zones will create, given the fact that there's going to be a reduction in revenue from LBTT? I would hope that the government would anticipate that this activity will mean that ultimately the government will benefit by having higher revenues. Yeah. So what kind of timescale are we talking about, and how are we going to achieve that, and what is expected to be achieved?
Well, the first point to note is that the LBTT only happens when somebody moves into the area. So the fact that if the counterfactual is that the transaction didn't happen, then you're not losing any money. The second point is...
Well, if they would have moved somewhere else where they would have to pay, then you are losing money, that's the point.
Yeah, but again, if you look at this in the context of what it's focused on, which is international, attraction of international investment, and for those cluster developments, it's largely... And if you look at the green ports, it's largely been in that space. The package from the UK Government of 320 million includes money within that to cover the foregone loss of the cost for LBTT. So that money is covered by UK Government in any event. So the Scottish Government is upside because it's the other revenue you would get from income tax or other taxes over time from the economic activity and the multiplier effects of that. So there's no loss per se to the Scottish Government in that regard.
But there's no ability to really quantify that at all, the gain that one would hope to
there is,
in terms of employment, additional taxation, revenue, whatever.
I'll reply back on that. It's not my area of portfolio, but I can come back on unless officials have anything specific on the numbers that I've done there. There are certainly numbers in terms of matched investment that is estimated or forecast to come in, which is I think somewhere north of 300 million, but you maybe want to comment on that.
Thank you. I think the first point here is that LBTT is an important part of the overall package, but the vast majority of the funding that will come from the UK government to us for these investment zones will be spent on non-tax interventions, skills programs, regional infrastructure. We are still going through the regional economic partnerships who will be managing and delivering these and have been integral to designing these investment zones are still going through their business case processes and doing economic analysis and appraisals of what the likely outcomes will be. What we can say now is that Glasgow City Region estimate that they will secure £63 million of match funding from the private sector. In the North East, it's expected to be around 260 million, with 10,000 and 18,000 jobs supported as well from these investment zones. There will be more detail forthcoming.
Sorry, over what time period?
Over the 10-year period of the programme. There will be more detail forthcoming in the coming months. We are somewhat beholden to the regional economic partnerships working with the companies and universities and relevant stakeholders who are developing the business cases now.
Okay. I mean, with regional planning partnerships, green ports, etc., there always seem to be vast numbers of jobs attached to these, but I never really see them quite materialising in the numbers that are being suggested. Anyway,
well, we have seen a number of significant investments coming in with jobs running into the hundreds, and they were really just at the start of this process.
Well, I think it's quite uneven, one would say, throughout the country, I think, to be fair. And we're not seeing that in Ayrshire. I think there's other areas where they're not really seeing that in terms of some of these regional deals. So I think there needs to be a greater focus on ensuring that what's being promised in terms of these developments that actually are delivered. Michael?
Yeah. Thanks, Minister. I mean, you mentioned that you weren't involved in the Minister in charge at the start of this process, so I think it dates back to 2023. Can you give us an understanding of your view of how the selection process was carried out?
So, again, I wasn't involved in this. I was involved heavily in the Greenport process, obviously, but I wasn't involved in the investment zone process. So, my understanding is that there was a rigorous process assessing a number of criteria was undertaken jointly by UK and Scottish governments, and obviously there's 2 investment zones in Scotland, and I think 8 across England and Wales. And the process that was undertaken was to assess those across a number of factors, and the decision was made on that basis between the 2 governments.
Okay. Was there any application process?
Not to my knowledge, no.
No, there wasn't. Okay. Because back in the time, so the allocation was made, I think it was the 22nd of June 2023. That was the announcement that Glasgow and Aberdeenshire were to qualify for this. The only correspondence would appear between Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Government ministers at the time happened that morning. So there was a letter that came on the 22nd of June to Scottish Government colleagues. I mean, the idea that you can write in the morning and get £80 million of funding by the afternoon is a bit of a joke, really, isn't it? I mean, there are general concerns about the conveners began to set out in terms of some of the regional issues and whether it be displacement issues, how these things might work, and we've entered into that. But surely there has to be a full transparency about how these decisions are made and whether there's actual proper evaluation taken about the economic impact and the potential.
Well, as I say, I wasn't involved in that process, and my understanding is that there was a rigorous process undertaken looking at a number of criteria considered between the 2 governments as to where the investment zones should be located.
So can you provide those criteria to the committee in writing, if not today? Or perhaps your official wants to do so.
So the methodology for the selection process is available online.
Okay.
And that involves the sort of high-level considerations, economic potential, innovation, knowledge anchors, as well as the specific metrics that were used between the UK government and Scottish government to select the 2 investment zones.
Yeah. I suppose it strikes me at the time, in terms of June 2023, that probably the principal metric was the fact that there was Conservative seats at risk in Aberdeenshire and SNP seats at risk in Glasgow, and that those are probably the first and foremost the issues about the 2 governments that were working together at that point to cut out other parts of the country, if I'm honest. So I think that this kind of approach does beg this issue. Whether the Minister might disagree with some of my interpretation of that, I'm sure he does. It begs this kind of question about if you can't have the full transparency, if you have a proper process in which people can develop bids that are actually based on the full economic potential of their areas. Is that not a problem you would have then, Minister, in terms of being able to realise the full economic potential of this kind of investment if you don't have a proper external bidding transparency based on long-term economic planning?
Well, I think it's important that there is a process and that the process is robust. And as officials have said, the criteria for that process is available online. There is an issue clearly that this is a zero-sum game. There only were 2 investment zones on offer from the UK government, and 2 areas had to be selected for that process, and criteria was taken forward on that basis. And at the end of the day, whatever areas were chosen through that process, there would be other areas, as indeed was the case with the Greenport selection process, who would make the case that they were hard done by, but that's the reality of it. There was only 2 had to be allocated, and a rigorous process was undertaken to select those 2.
Thank you.
Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. As I think you said in your opening questions, a couple of years ago, one of your colleagues was here to bring forward very similar measures in relation to free ports to the measure that you're bringing here in relation to investment zones. And at that point, my colleague, Ross Greer, who was on the committee at that time, asked whether there were any measures being taken forward to restrict the relief in respect of companies that use tax havens. Am I right in assuming that nothing different has happened this time and that tax dodgers will still be entitled to access this tax relief?
Well, everyone has to pay their tax legally, so I'm not quite clear what you mean by tax dodgers.
Well, those who use tax havens. Legal tax avoidance.
Anyone that's taking advantage or investing in the areas and taking advantage of the incentives that are on offer has to comply with all legal requirements, be that with regards to paying their tax, be it with regards to regulatory issues, be it with regard to environmental or employment law issues or any other issues. So they need to comply with all of those laws and regulations as anyone else would.
Yes, they need to comply with the law, but the law allows them to use tax havens. And the Scottish Government has in the past taken a different approach. For example, in the emergency release that came in during the pandemic, it was agreed, after suggestions from my own party, that should be restricted to those who are based in tax havens. Why is the Government not taking the same approach?
As I say, anyone that is taking advantage of those incentives and investing in those areas has to comply with all legal requirements. So
that's the last answer you gave me.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's the answer to the question. So
the question I'm asking is, why is it a good thing in principle, in terms of the Government's own policy? You want the alleged economic activity that this policy will generate to benefit Scotland. Why is it a good thing in principle that it should be available to those who siphon their profits into tax havens?
So I don't know, does the member have examples of specific companies that this is applying to?
Well, it doesn't apply yet, does it? Because you're just bringing forward the regulation.
Sure, but already applies in green ports, for example.
Whether the regulation ought to restrict this tax relief in respect of companies that are based in tax havens.
And how would you define that?
Well,
I said that the requirement is they have to comply with all legal
there's
requirements.
There's a widely recognised UN list of tax havens, and that's the definition that was used in respect to the COVID tax reliefs that came in at that point.
Well, as I said, anyone that's taking advantage of those incentives has to comply with all legal requirements. If there's anything more specific you want to follow up on, I'm happy to follow up on that if a member wants to write on that, but that's the situation.
So we made the case at the time that this was brought in for free ports that there should be a restriction in respect of companies that use tax havens, that they should not be able to access this relief. So the Government is already very familiar with the argument. It's been put before. And we put the same argument in relation to companies that use that pay below the real living wage. The Government has a strong track record of supporting the real living wage and wanting to promote that. And it took several years of consistent pressure to persuade the Government that it did, in fact, have the power to use procurement and the provision of grants to attach conditions on that to ensure that the real living wage is paid. And yet, in relation to this, the tax relief issue, it's still saying, the Government is still saying that you can't do it, even though this is tax relief that's coming from a very flexible pot of funding. Anything you don't use in tax reliefs, as you've just said a few minutes ago, you can spend in other flexible ways within these investment zones. So why are you taking this very, unconditional approach, a blanket approach to a tax relief, rather than one that is targeted to companies and businesses that behave in an ethical way, that don't use tax havens, that don't pay poverty wages?
Well, the member will be aware that there's a whole list of criteria that have to be complied with for the company to be eligible for the reliefs.
They don't include the criteria that I'm suggesting.
Well, in terms of the fair work criteria, I mean, we have, I would like to suggest, done absolutely as much as we can in that space, given that we don't have control over employment laws. So there are restrictions on what we can do there legally. But you'll be very aware that the work we did on green ports, for example, we only engaged in that process when there was a commitment from UK Government and all parties that they would comply with that fair work agenda. That has been signed up to by the green ports, and they are taking that forward in terms of the engagement engagement with the businesses that are seeking to base themselves. And one of the criteria they use to assess a business is their compliance with those Fair Work agendas. And it's the same process here. There's a code of conduct being written up by both the regional economic partnerships that they use to assess the bids to determine their eligibility to be able to comply with those criteria to be able to receive the benefits. Now, as I say, there are restrictions certainly in terms of Fair Work because we don't have control over employment law and what we can actually do here. So we're using other measures to try and circumvent that to be able to influence behaviour of businesses. But it's something that we take very seriously, and something I believe we've done everything we can to be able to make that the criteria in place for those benefits.
Just to be clear about what you're claiming and what you're not claiming in that answer. Are you saying that a company which pays below the real living wage will not be entitled to access this tax relief?
That's what's in the... Well, first of all, there are legal restrictions on what we can do, right? Because we don't have control of employment law. It's in the code of conduct, and it's a criteria that is used to assess whether businesses will be eligible for the benefits or not, as is the case with Greenports.
So you're saying the payment of the real living wage is a criteria?
Yes.
And that those who don't meet that criteria will not be able to access this tax relief?
That would be assessed at the point where they make the application for the benefit, for the tax benefit, for the relief.
And does that mean that they would not be entitled to access the relief?
That is in the code of conduct, and they need to comply with that to be able to access the relief, yes.
Okay, so why then can't you take the same approach if you're giving that clear guarantee that no company that pays below the living wage will access this relief? Why can't you take the same approach in respect of the use of tax havens?
Thank you. So it was just to add on the point about Fair Work and the codes of conduct the Minister was referring to. So we have given a lot of autonomy in this programme to the regional economic partnerships themselves. So the local authorities who will be managing the tax sites, they are the ones who are required to follow the Fair Work principles that we have set out. It is conditional on them receiving this funding in this programme, and it is for them to make sure that companies within their tax sites that set up there, that receive reliefs, are complying also and demonstrating that they are following those Fair Work principles. The codes of conduct themselves are being sort of drafted as we speak. They are not finalised. There will be specific guidance on tax site management issued from the regional economic partnerships in the coming months, where there should hopefully be more detail on this.
Okay, that sounds as though the Minister's answer wasn't as robust as he seemed to suggest it was. If the codes of conduct are still being written and the local authorities, rather than the regulations you're proposing, will determine how these rules are applied, then it doesn't sound as though the clear guarantee is that companies that use these practices won't access the relief.
We're still in the development phase of the investment zones, but throughout this entire process, which has been co-designed with the UK government and the regional economic partnerships themselves, we've made clear that the Fair Work principles, that they will need to demonstrate how they are going to meet those and make sure that any new companies that set up in the tax sites are following those principles. We haven't yet got the specific detail of what that code of conduct will look like, but we will have that very soon. But we've been very clear that we're looking for ambition in this area, and that them receiving this funding is conditioned on those Fair Work principles being followed.
You're looking for ambition. But is it... I'm sorry to press this. Last opportunity. Is it the case or is it not the case that a company which pays below the living wage, the real living wage, will be denied this tax relief under LBT?
Companies have to make the commitment that is what that they are meeting the code of conduct.
Okay. Thank you, I think.
Want to come in with supplementary?
Yes, thanks very much. In answers to my original questions, you leaned heavily, Minister, on a robust methodology for the selection. Could you tell me the date when that methodology was agreed?
Not, I don't know, any officials, anything on the specifics on that? I might need to come back on that.
I think we would have to come back on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, because in a Freedom of Information request published on the 18th of August 2024, it states that the methodology was agreed on the 22nd of June. Mr Farrell mentioned that the methodology has subsequently been published on the website, which is welcome, but that's the same day that the decision was made. So the methodology was agreed on the same day that the decision is made. But do you think that would be normal practice for allocation of public funds, Minister?
I would need to go and look at the details on the
Okay.
specific dates that you're quoting there, because I'm not familiar with those dates.
So it happened in one phone call between ministers, the methodology and the allocation of where this money was to go in Scotland.
I would need to go and check the details on that, the specifics, but clearly there was quite an involved process to be gone through here. It
doesn't sound very involved.
Expect
Sounds
that
like
there
one
would be
phone
more
call
engagement
there.
in that, but if, as I say, we'll come back on the specifics on the details of
And none of the officials were
process.
involved in that discussion at the time that are with you today?
No, I'm afraid not. There was a significant level of engagement at official level as well between the UK government and Scottish government on the selection methodology and how the two sites were chosen.
Okay, because it says that actually there wasn't said the methodology wasn't discussed in great detail when it was agreed between ministers. So and that's in the Freedom of Information request as well. So perhaps you could come back, clarity, Minister, because you are leaning quite heavily on the idea that there was some kind of robust methodology. All the indications are that there really wasn't. There was a political stitch-up. So if you can give us some more detail on that, I think that would be entirely welcome. Thank you.
Craig.
Good morning, Minister. Just for the record, in terms of the structure of investment zones and the way that this relief will apply in Scotland, is this broadly comparable or an absolute replica of the way in which investment zones in England are applying reliefs on stamp duty?
It says, I think it's certainly broadly aligned, and I think in terms of the detail, I don't know if there's any areas where it diverges, but my understanding is it's aligned. Yeah.
In terms of the tax reliefs, it's yes broadly aligned. We've sought to seek a level of parity between investment zones in England and Scotland to not disadvantage anyone.
Fine. And I just know that some investment zones and free ports in England have not been designated as special tax sites, whereas the two in Scotland have. Is there any reason as to why in England some investment zones are not special tax sites, but both in Scotland are?
I don't have the detail on English tax sites, I'm afraid.
Fine, okay. And just lastly, Minister, in terms of just implicit within this, or perhaps explicit within this, is an acceptance that you can achieve behavioural change within the corporate environment by reducing or eliminating taxes. Looking at the structure of LBTT in a corporate environment, would it be a goal of this government to try and make sure that there are greater incentives to bring these sorts of developments to Scotland than there would be in other parts of the UK? And at this point in time, what assessment have you made in terms of the competitiveness of the LBTT structure versus the full stamp duty regime in England?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's part of the picture, right? So I think it's important that, that this is targeted, that you're clear about what it is you're trying to do, and you understand the reason for that. Now, with regards to green pots, with regard to investment zones, it's about targeting specific industrial sectors in specific locations where there are inherent advantages, with an intention of building clusters in those technologies that are world competitive to attract those technologies. Now, the tax piece of it is a part of it. If you look at the total amount of money with regards to investment zones, the amount of that is allocated to tax as opposed to skills or infrastructure or other site readiness measures is actually a very, very small percentage of the total. And if you look at the decision-making criteria for companies, this will be part of it, but again, it will be a small part of their overall consideration. So, in answer to your question, yes, those incentives and reliefs can play a role, but they need to be targeted. You need to understand what it is you're trying to achieve with them.
But you would accept the principle that by reducing a tax or eliminating it altogether, you can achieve a positive outcome?
If it's a targeted in a specific way for a specific purpose, yes, of course.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything else you want to add before we move on, Minister?
No, thanks.
Okay, thank you. We now return to agenda item 4, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S6M 20212, that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Investment Zones Relief Scotland Order 2026 draft be approved. Minister?
Moved.
Do any members wish to speak? Patrick?
Thank you, Convener. I'm grateful to the Minister for his comments during the evidence session on this. He appeared to give a fairly clear reassurance on the issue of the minimum wage. However, given that the codes of practice referred to haven't been finalised, it does feel as though that reassurance might be premature, and he wasn't able to give any kind of reassurance the kind I was seeking in respect of the issue of the use of tax havens. And so for that reason, I'll be opposing the resolution.
Any other colleagues wish to contribute to the debate? Minister, to wind up.
Nothing further to add.
Okay, I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M 20212 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour? All those against? Abstentions? The motion is agreed to. I'd like to thank the Minister for his evidence today. Minister, we'll publish a short report to the Parliament, send out a decision on the instrument in due course, and I now close the public part of today's meeting. I just ask colleagues to stay behind for a short update.